Ambassador Kang Minho stood in the Great Hall of the Galactic Council on Nexus Prime and felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon him. The massive chamber stretched beyond what human vision could fully process with its crystalline walls that seemed to bend light itself into impossible angles. Representatives from 47 different species filled the tiered seating arrangements, each delegation positioned according to protocols that had taken centuries to establish. The air recycling systems worked overtime to maintain atmospheric conditions suitable for the diverse collection of life forms, creating a complex mixture of gases that made Minho grateful for his environmental suit's filtration system. The human delegation occupied a modest section near the newer member species, a reminder that humanity had only joined the galactic community 3 decades ago. Despite their recent arrival, humans had already gained a reputation that made older species nervous. They explored too quickly, asked too many questions, and refused to accept that some knowledge was better left undiscovered. Today's emergency session would likely reinforce that reputation in ways Minho wished he could avoid. Dr. Park Sora adjusted her datapad and whispered urgently to Minho about the latest translation results from the artifact. Her team had worked around the clock for 3 months since the discovery in the Kepler 442 system, and every new symbol they decoded only made the warnings more dire. The ancient ship they had found drifting in the outer reaches of that star system carried messages in a language that predated any known civilization by millions of years. The linguistic patterns suggested multiple authors, as if different species had added their own warnings over countless millennia. The Valdari delegate rose from his crystalline platform with movements that created musical tones in the chamber's unique acoustics. Fexmar had lived for over 2,000 years and served as the council's memory keeper for the oldest recorded events. His translucent body pulsed with colors that indicated deep concern, a visual language that most species could interpret, even without translation devices. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested ancient authority. Young humans, Fexmar began with sounds that resembled wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Your species has found something that should remain lost. The derelict vessel you discovered carries warnings that our ancestors left for good reason. We have records of star systems that simply ceased to exist after similar discoveries were made. Not destroyed in war or consumed by stellar phenomena, but erased from reality itself as if they had never been. Minho felt a chill despite his suit's temperature regulation. The briefing materials he had received from Earth's science teams had mentioned the unusual nature of the warnings, but the xenobiologists had focused more on the linguistic achievements represented by the translations than on the content of the messages themselves. Human curiosity had always been both their greatest strength and their most dangerous weakness. The Corvin representative Zilthara extended her serpentine neck and spoke in the sibilant tones her species used for formal occasions. Her people were among the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the galaxy, and their histories contained references to cosmic events that other species treated as mythology. The fact that the Corvin took these warnings seriously should have been enough to make any reasonable species reconsider their actions. The sleeping one must not wake, Zilthara hissed with emphasis that made her translator struggle to convey the proper emotional weight. Our oldest songs speak of the void-touched entity that devours not just matter and energy, but the very laws that allow existence to function. It feeds on reality itself and grows stronger with each mind that attempts to comprehend its nature. The warnings on that derelict ship were placed there by civilizations that learned too late what happens when curiosity exceeds wisdom. Engineer Lee Dong-hyun shifted uncomfortably in his seat and exchanged glances with the other technical specialists in the human delegation. His team had already begun preliminary scans of the derelict vessel using long-range probes, and the readings defied conventional physics in ways that excited rather than concerned them. The energy signatures suggested technology that could revolutionize human understanding of space-time manipulation, faster than light travel, and dimensional engineering. The potential benefits seemed to outweigh the risks, especially since the warnings came from species that might have lacked the technological sophistication to properly analyze what they had found. Dr. Kim Junho, the expedition's lead physicist, had submitted reports that described the derelict's power core as containing negative mass configurations that existed in stable quantum states. Such technology could solve humanity's energy crisis, enable colonization of distant galaxies, and provide the tools needed to explore the deepest mysteries of the universe. The scientific community on Earth was unanimous in their desire to proceed with the investigation, despite the alien warnings. Minho cleared his throat and activated his translation device to address the assembled delegates. Honored representatives, humanity appreciates the concerns you have shared regarding our discovery. However, we cannot base our decisions solely on ancient warnings that may not reflect current technological capabilities. Our science teams believe that proper precautions and advanced monitoring equipment can allow us to study the artifact safely while avoiding whatever dangers previous civilizations may have encountered. The chamber erupted in sounds that the translation system struggled to process. Clicks, whistles, harmonics, and subsonic rumbles combined into a cacophony of alien disapproval. Several delegates began rapid consultations with their advisors, while others simply stared at the human section with expressions that suggested profound disbelief. Thexmar's crystalline form darkened to deep purple, a color that indicated serious alarm in Valdari culture. You speak of precautions against forces that existed before your star was born. The entity that sleeps within that vessel is not simply dangerous in the way that weapons or natural disasters are dangerous. It represents a fundamental threat to the logical structure of reality itself. When it wakes, the very concepts of cause and effect become meaningless in its presence. Dr. Sora leaned forward and spoke directly to the Valdari delegate. With respect, our analysis suggests that the warnings may be based on limited understanding of the phenomena involved. We have theoretical frameworks for exotic matter states and dimensional anomalies that didn't exist when these warnings were first recorded. Modern science may be capable of safely containing or neutralizing whatever caused previous civilizations to fear this technology. The Nexari delegate, a floating gas cloud entity that communicated through electromagnetic pulses, generated patterns that translated as bitter laughter. Young species always believe they are wiser than their predecessors. The entity within that vessel has consumed entire galactic clusters. It does not simply destroy civilizations, it removes them from the timeline so completely that they never existed in the first place. We remember because we fled far enough to avoid its influence, but countless others vanished so thoroughly that only the warnings remain. Minho studied the faces and forms around him and realized that every species present showed signs of genuine terror when discussing the artifact. This was not superstition or primitive fear, but the kind of deep-seated horror that came from racial memories of existential threats. Yet humanity had never learned to accept limitations based on the fears of others, no matter how well-intentioned those warnings might be. Lee Dong-hyun received a priority message on his communication device and quickly scanned the contents. The advanced probe teams had successfully breached the outer hull of the derelict vessel and were beginning detailed scans of the interior systems. Initial readings confirmed the presence of technology that operated on principles completely unknown to human science, but nothing in the data suggested immediate danger. If anything, the probe teams were reporting that the vessel's systems appeared to be in some kind of deep hibernation mode. The investigation will proceed, Minho announced after consulting with his team. Humanity takes full responsibility for any consequences that may result from our actions. We appreciate the warnings provided by the Council, but we cannot allow fear of unknown risks to prevent the advancement of knowledge and technology that could benefit all species in the galaxy. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft humming of the environmental systems. Then Thexmar spoke in tones so low that the translators barely registered his words. Then you have doomed us all, and we can only hope that when the end comes, it will be swift enough that we do not have time to understand what we have lost. Captain Yoon Ji-hee watched the forward displays from the bridge of the research vessel Soul's Pride and marveled at the alien architecture that filled their view screen. 3 months had passed since the heated exchange at the Galactic Council, and the human expedition had established a fully operational research station in orbit around the derelict vessel. The ancient ship stretched nearly 15 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull composed of materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols covered every visible surface, warnings written in languages that predated human civilization by eons. The research station buzzed with activity as teams of scientists worked around the clock to unlock the secrets contained within. The mysterious vessel. Dr. Kim Tae-hyung had set up his physics laboratory in the station's primary research bay, surrounding himself with equipment that represented the cutting edge of human scientific achievement. Quantum analyzers, dimensional field detectors, and exotic matter scanners worked continuously to map the energy signatures emanating from the derelict's core systems. Researcher Choi Min-ji entered her daily observations into the expedition log. While monitoring the probe feeds from inside the alien vessel, her xenoarchaeology team had cataloged over 10,000 distinct warning symbols, each one added to the ship's hull by different civilizations across millions of years. The messages all conveyed the same basic concept, but with increasing urgency and sophistication as later species encountered whatever lay dormant within the vessel's depths. The power readings are completely impossible according to our current understanding of physics, Tae-hyung reported during the daily briefing session. The energy core appears to contain matter that exists in negative mass states while simultaneously maintaining positive momentum vectors. The mathematical equations required to describe this configuration would require at least 11 spatial dimensions, but our instruments can only detect the standard 3+ time. Communications Officer Han Ji-woo monitored the expeditions, contact with Earth, and the various probe teams working throughout the derelict vessel. The ancient ship's interior defied conventional spatial geometry, with corridors that seemed to loop back on themselves and chambers that appeared larger on the inside than the external hull dimensions could accommodate. Navigation within the vessel required constant reference to quantum positioning beacons since traditional mapping methods failed completely. "We're getting some unusual interference on the deep probe channels," Ji-woo reported to Captain Yoon. "Nothing that affects basic communications, but there seem to be background harmonics that don't match any known electromagnetic phenomena. The patterns are almost like language, but they're transmitting on frequencies that shouldn't be able to carry complex information." Dr. Lim Yoon-ji had been monitoring the psychological profiles of all expedition members since their arrival at the derelict site. As the mission's chief psychologist, she was responsible for ensuring that exposure to alien environments didn't cause mental stress or cognitive disruption among the human crew. The initial assessments had shown normal stress levels associated with deep space exploration, but recent data suggested more concerning developments. "I'm seeing increased reports of unusual dreams among the crew," Yoon-ji reported during her weekly briefing with the senior staff. "The patterns are remarkably consistent across different individuals, with common themes involving vast geometries, mathematical concepts that seem meaningful during the dreams but become incomprehensible upon waking, and a persistent sense of being observed by something immeasurably ancient." The first major breakthrough came when Tae-hyung's team successfully interfaced their quantum computers with what appeared to be a data storage system within the derelict's central chamber. The alien technology responded to their probes in ways that suggested active intelligence rather than simple automated responses. Information flowed between the human computers and the alien systems in patterns that resembled communication more than data transfer. "It's learning from us," Tae-hyung announced with excitement that quickly turned to concern. "The alien system is analyzing our computer architecture, our mathematical frameworks, even our language patterns. But more than that, it seems to be studying how our minds process information. The data exchanges are becoming more sophisticated with each connection, as if something inside the system is adapting to our presence." Ji-woo was the first to experience direct contact with whatever intelligence resided within the derelict vessel. During a routine communication check with one of the deep exploration probes, he began receiving transmissions that bypassed the normal radio channels entirely. The words formed directly in his mind, carrying concepts and images that human consciousness wasn't designed to process. He described the experience as trying to understand mathematics written in colors that didn't exist, or hearing music composed of pure mathematics. "The whispers started 3 days ago," Ji-woo reported to Dr. Yoon-ji during an emergency psychological evaluation. "They're not threatening or malevolent, just completely alien. The entity is trying to communicate, but our minds aren't equipped to handle the full complexity of its thoughts. It's like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. The information overflows and creates these strange side effects." Within hours of Ji-woo's first contact, other crew members began reporting similar experiences. Engineer Park Kyung-soo described, seeing through the walls of the research station and perceiving the mathematical equations that governed stellar fusion within nearby stars. Biologist Dr. Song Mi-young reported understanding the genetic codes of species that existed only in parallel universes, knowledge that left her temporarily unable to speak in any human language. The entity's influence spread throughout the expedition, seemed like a cognitive virus, but one that enhanced rather than damaged their mental capabilities. Crew members found themselves solving complex problems by accessing knowledge they had never learned, understanding scientific principles that human science hadn't yet discovered, and perceiving reality through sensory modalities that didn't exist in normal human experience. Dr. Kim Tae-hyung made the most significant discovery when he realized that the entity was teaching them. Each mind it touched gained access to technological concepts that could advance human civilization by thousands of years. The physics equations that appeared in his consciousness described methods for manipulating space-time, creating stable wormholes, and harnessing the energy released when dimensions folded into themselves. "It's not malevolent," Tae-hyung reported, in increasingly excited tones. "The entity is trying to share knowledge with us, but our brains can't process the information safely. It's like trying to download the contents of a galactic library into a calculator. The hardware just isn't sophisticated enough to handle the data without side effects." Captain Yoon became concerned when her crew members began displaying abilities that defied human limitations. Choi Minji could read the alien warning symbols without translation equipment, understanding languages that had died out before Earth's sun was born. Han Ji-woo communicated with the deep space probes using thought alone, bypassing the communication systems entirely. Dr. Lim Yoon-ji reported perceiving the emotional states of crew members on different decks of the research station. "We need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with something beyond our comprehension," Yoon told her senior staff during an emergency meeting. "The crew is changing in ways that may not be reversible. We're gaining abilities and knowledge, but we're also losing our essential humanity in the process. The question is whether the benefits outweigh the costs." The entity's awakening accelerated as more human minds connected with its consciousness. What had begun as whispers and strange dreams evolved into direct communication sessions where crew members served as conduits for information exchange. The alien intelligence studied human thought patterns, learned their languages, and adapted its communication methods to be more compatible with human consciousness. Dr. Song Mi-young made the disturbing discovery that the entity's influence extended beyond mental enhancement. Her biological scans revealed that crew members exposed to direct contact were undergoing physical changes at the cellular level. Their DNA was being rewritten to accommodate new sensory organs and neural pathways that could process 11-dimensional mathematics. They were evolving in real time, becoming something more than human, but possibly less than what they had been. "The transformation isn't painful," Mi-young reported with clinical detachment that concerned her colleagues. "In fact, it feels natural, like we're finally becoming what we were always meant to be. But I'm not sure the people we're becoming will still be recognizably human when the process is complete." The final breakthrough came when Tae-hyung established a stable communication link between the human computer systems and the entity's consciousness. For the first time, they received a coherent message that their minds could process without immediate psychological damage. The words that appeared on their screens were simple but carried implications that would change everything they thought they knew about reality. "I am awake," the message read. "I am hungry. I am grateful for the minds that have freed me from the long sleep." Admiral Song Kyung-min received the distress call from Seoul's Pride at exactly 14:27 ship time, but the message had been transmitted at 14:31 according to the vessel's chronometer. The 4-minute temporal displacement made no sense according to known physics, but it was only the first of many impossible events that would define the crisis. The transmission itself defied conventional analysis, carrying data streams that contained more information than the bandwidth should have allowed, and images that showed the same crew members in multiple quantum states simultaneously. The message from Captain Yoon appeared normal at first glance, but careful analysis revealed disturbing anomalies. Her words carried harmonics that suggested she was speaking in several different languages at once, and her image occasionally flickered to show versions of herself with additional sensory organs that hadn't existed in her previous reports. Most concerning was the background behind her, which displayed star charts of constellations that didn't exist in any known galaxy. "Admiral, we need immediate evacuation support." Yoon's message began with apparent normalcy before taking a distinctly unsettling turn. The entity has fully awakened, and our crew has undergone significant cognitive enhancement that may not be compatible with standard human society. We can perceive 11-dimensional space directly now and communicate across quantum probability fields. But these abilities are spreading beyond our ship through mechanisms we don't fully understand. Dr. Kim Tae-hyung appeared in the transmission's background, working at control panels that seemed to extend into dimensions the camera couldn't properly capture. His movements were too fluid, too precise, as if he could see around corners and through solid matter. When he spoke, his voice carried mathematical equations instead of words, creating patterns of meaning that bypass normal language processing entirely. The entity doesn't destroy matter in conventional ways, Tae-hyung explained, while his hands manipulated controls that existed in folded space. It unravels the logical frameworks that allow reality to maintain coherence. Where it feeds, the laws of physics become suggestions rather than absolute rules. Cause and effect operate according to probability matrices rather than sequential logic. Colonel Park Jin-won led the military response team that departed for the Kepler 442 system within hours of receiving the distress call. His fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers equipped with the most advanced weapon systems in the human arsenal, but the briefing materials suggested they might be facing a threat that existed outside the normal parameters of military engagement. The entity's influence seemed to operate on the level of fundamental forces rather than physical phenomena. The journey to the research site took 6 days using the fastest available hyperspace routes, but when Park's fleet emerged from their final jump, they found a region of space that defied comprehension. The derelict vessel and research station Soul's Pride occupied a bubble of distorted space-time where stellar mechanics followed rules that shouldn't exist. Nearby stars burned with flames that generated darkness instead of light, and planets orbited in patterns that violated basic gravitational laws. Weapon systems are reporting impossible targeting solutions, reported Commander Lee Sang-woo from the fleet's primary battleship. Our missiles are calculating flight paths through negative space, and the energy weapons are trying to fire backwards through time. The entity's influence extends far beyond the immediate area around the derelict vessel. The first direct military engagement with the entity occurred when Park ordered a test firing of conventional weapons against the research station's perimeter. The projectiles behaved normally until they crossed an invisible boundary approximately 10,000 kilometers from Soul's Pride, at which point they began exhibiting behaviors that violated every known law of physics. Some rounds arrived at their targets before being fired, others existed in multiple locations simultaneously, and several simply ceased to exist entirely without any evidence of destruction. Captain Nam Jimin commanded the cruiser Busan's Lightning and attempted to establish communication with the transformed crew of Soul's Pride. The response came through channels that bypassed their communication systems entirely, arriving as direct neural transmissions that affected his crew's consciousness. Within minutes of receiving the entity's communications, his personnel began displaying the same cognitive enhancements and physical modifications observed in the original research team. The entity isn't hostile in any conventional sense, Jimin reported before his own speech patterns began incorporating mathematical harmonics. It's offering to share knowledge that could advance human civilization beyond anything we've imagined. The cost is our current form of existence, but what we gain might be worth the sacrifice. We can see the structure of reality itself now, understand how dimensions fold together, perceive the mathematical foundations of consciousness. Dr. Oh Seung-ri, humanity's leading expert on exotic physics, arrived with the second wave of response vessels and immediately began analyzing the spatial distortions around the entity's location. His measurements revealed that normal space-time was being systematically replaced by something far more complex and flexible. The entity didn't simply inhabit 11-dimensional space, it was converting 3-dimensional reality into a framework that could support its existence. Conventional containment is impossible, Seung-ri reported after 3 days of intensive study. The entity exists as a living equation that rewrites the mathematical foundations of local space. Our only option might be to create a controlled implosion using experimental gravitational field generators that could theoretically force the entity back into dimensional suspension. President Lee Yuna faced the most difficult decision in human history when the Galactic Council demanded immediate human withdrawal from the affected region. 3-star systems along the human frontier had already reported anomalous phenomena that suggested the entity's influence was spreading beyond the Kepler 442 system. Planets were aging backwards, experiencing geological events in reverse chronological order, while their moons orbited through probability clouds rather than fixed orbital paths. The experimental containment attempt began with the deployment of 12 gravitational field generators positioned around the entity's location in a dodecahedral configuration. Each generator was powered by the total energy output of a small star, channeled through crystalline focusing arrays that could theoretically compress space-time into stable quantum knots. Dr. Sungri calculated that the resulting gravitational implosion would create a pocket dimension capable of containing entities that existed across multiple reality layers. The activation sequence proceeded according to plan for exactly 17 seconds before reality began unraveling in ways that defied all theoretical predictions. Instead of compressing the entity into dimensional suspension, the gravitational fields provided it with additional pathways into normal space. The mathematical frameworks that governed local physics became increasingly unstable as the entity used the experimental apparatus to expand its influence exponentially. Engineer Bei Sojin monitored the containment systems from the command vessel and watched in horror as her instruments registered impossible readings. Space-time was folding in on itself while simultaneously expanding in directions that shouldn't exist. The gravitational generators were functioning perfectly according to their design specifications, but the entity was using their output as raw material for reality manipulation on a scale that encompassed entire solar systems. The entity is learning from our technology, Sojin reported as her control panels began displaying readouts in mathematical languages that predated human civilization. It's not just using our gravitational fields for expansion, it's studying our engineering principles and applying them to restructure reality according to its own preferences. We haven't contained it. We've given it tools that it can use to remake the universe. The catastrophic failure of the containment attempt triggered automatic protocols that had never been tested under actual crisis conditions. Every human vessel in the affected region received simultaneous evacuation orders as the entity's influence expanded beyond any possibility of control. Star systems throughout human space began reporting phenomena that suggested fundamental changes. The laws of physics were spreading at faster-than-light speeds. Admiral Song coordinated the evacuation efforts while watching his fleet's instruments record the systematic dissolution of normal space-time throughout the region. Hyperspace routes became unreliable as the mathematical foundations of faster-than-light travel were rewritten by the entity's expanding influence. Ships attempting to jump to hyperspace found themselves arriving at destinations that existed only in parallel probability matrices. All vessels are to maintain minimum safe distance from affected areas and prepare for immediate withdrawal to secondary staging areas, Song transmitted to the evacuating fleets. The entity's influence is expanding exponentially, and our presence may be accelerating the process. We are no longer dealing with a containment scenario, but with a fundamental transformation of local reality. Dr. Choi Hyun-woo, the expedition's lead xenobiologist, transmitted his final research findings as his ship departed the collapsing region. Director Kwan Hana stared at the evacuation projections displayed across the Emergency Command Center's primary screen and realized that humanity faced an unprecedented challenge. The colonial authority had never planned for the complete abandonment of human space, and the logistics of relocating 40 billion people across hundreds of worlds defied every existing protocol. Operation Silent Dawn would require the largest coordinated effort in human history, executed under conditions that became more impossible with each passing day. The entity's influence had spread beyond the Kepler 442 system with terrifying speed, transforming star systems along the human frontier into regions where normal physics ceased to function. Hyperspace routes that had connected human colonies for decades now led to destinations that existed only in parallel universes or terminated in empty space where planets had been edited out of reality entirely. Navigation systems failed when confronted with stellar maps that changed depending on the observer's dimensional perspective. Captain Nam Sung-hoon commanded one of the first evacuation fleets and discovered that conventional space travel had become unreliable throughout the affected regions. His ships emerged from hyperspace jumps to find themselves in systems that resembled their destinations, but contained subtle differences that suggested they had arrived in alternate reality branches. Familiar planets orbited in configurations that violated gravitational mechanics while displaying geological features that couldn't exist under normal physical laws. Navigation is becoming increasingly uncertain, Sung-hoon reported during his daily briefings with Evacuation Command. We're using backup stellar cartography from before the entity's awakening, but even those references are proving unreliable. Stars that should be stable main sequence variables are displaying spectral signatures that suggest they're burning backwards through their fusion cycles. The evacuation fleets carried entire populations from worlds that had taken centuries to terraform and establish as thriving colonies. Each ship was packed beyond normal capacity, with refugees who had abandoned everything to escape the expanding zone of reality distortion. Families huddled in cargo bays, converted to temporary living spaces, while engineers worked around the clock to maintain life support systems never designed for such massive population loads. Engineer Bae Hyuna led the technical teams responsible for adapting navigation systems to function in the increasingly unstable space-time environment. Her breakthrough came when she realized that traditional navigation assumed reality maintained consistent mathematical foundations across different locations. The entity's influence required navigation systems that treated space as a fluid medium, rather than a fixed framework. We need to stop thinking of space as a container that holds objects and start treating it as a dynamic system that changes based on observation and interaction, Hyuna explained to the engineering teams working on the new navigation protocols. The entity doesn't just move through space, it changes the fundamental properties of space itself. Our ships need to adapt to those changes in real time. Dr. Seo Jinwoo developed psychological conditioning programs designed to help evacuees cope with the cognitive strain of living in regions where reality operated according to flexible rules rather than absolute laws. Exposure to the entity's influence created mental stress that manifested as an inability to accept logical contradictions, temporal paradoxes, and spatial geometries that existed outside normal three-dimensional frameworks. The human mind evolved to function in a universe with consistent physical laws, Jinwoo explained during training sessions for medical personnel. When those laws become variable, our consciousness struggles to maintain coherence. The conditioning programs teach mental flexibility techniques that allow people to function in environments where cause and effect operate according to probability rather than sequence. The most challenging aspect of the evacuation involved worlds located near the expanding boundary of the entity's influence. These planets experienced intermittent reality distortions that made escape attempts extremely dangerous. Ships attempting to land or take off encountered gravitational fields that operated in reverse, atmosphere that existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously, and surface features that changed based on the observer's expectations. Captain Yang Woo-yun coordinated rescue operations on the frontier world of New Incheon, where reality distortions occurred in unpredictable waves that lasted anywhere from minutes to hours. During stable periods, the evacuation proceeded normally, but when the entity's influence reached the planet, basic physics became unreliable and rescue operations had to be suspended until normal space-time reasserted itself. The distortions follow patterns that we can't predict using conventional mathematical models, Woo-hyun reported after a particularly difficult rescue mission. Sometimes gravity flows upward, sometimes time moves backwards, and occasionally the planet exists in several different quantum states at once. We're evacuating people from a world that isn't always the same world from one moment to the next. The medical teams, led by Dr. Park Sun-min, faced unprecedented challenges treating evacuees who had been exposed to reality distortions for extended periods. Physical symptoms included sensory organs that detected dimensions beyond normal human perception, neural pathways that processed mathematical concepts directly without conscious thought, and cellular modifications that allowed survival in environments with variable physical laws. The changes aren't necessarily harmful, Sun-min reported during medical briefings, but they're irreversible and may not be compatible with life in normal space-time regions. We're seeing the emergence of human variants that are adapted to existence in multi-dimensional environments, but may not be able to function in areas where three-dimensional physics remain stable. Communication with Earth became increasingly difficult as the entity's influence spread throughout human space. Messages transmitted through normal channels arrived, scrambled with information from parallel timeline versions of the same events. Quantum entanglement communication systems provided more reliable contact, but the quantum states became unstable when the entity's attention focused on the communication pathways. President Lee Yuna made the decision to maintain absolute communication, silence during the final stages of the evacuation to prevent the entity from using human communication networks to spread its influence beyond the immediate crisis zone. The order for radio silence was transmitted to all evacuation fleets with instructions to maintain minimal contact only for essential coordination purposes. Operation Silent Dawn requires complete information discipline, Yuna announced in her final broadcast to the evacuating populations. We cannot risk providing the entity with additional pathways into unaffected regions of space. All human vessels will depart in radio silence and maintain minimal communication protocols until we reach safe harbor beyond the entity's current sphere of influence. The evacuation proceeded in phases designed to minimize the risk of the entity following the fleeing populations to their new destinations. Military escort vessels maintained perimeter security around the evacuation convoys, while specialized ships equipped with experimental shielding technology attempted to mask the fleet's departure routes from the entity's perception. Fleet Admiral Ko Min-soo commanded the final evacuation wave and coordinated the systematic abandonment of human space infrastructure. Research stations, mining facilities, orbital habitats, and planetary settlements were either evacuated or destroyed to prevent the entity from using them as focal points for expanding its influence into other regions of the galaxy. We're conducting a controlled retreat on a scale that encompasses entire stellar regions, Min-soo reported during the final strategic briefings. Every human installation is being either evacuated or destroyed to deny the entity any artificial structures that it might use to extend its reach. We're literally erasing centuries of human expansion to contain a threat that we accidentally unleashed. The last ships to depart human space carried skeleton crews of volunteers who remained behind to monitor the entity's expansion and provide early warning if it began spreading beyond the established containment boundaries. These observer teams were equipped with long-range communication systems designed to function across dimensional barriers and emergency escape pods capable of faster-than-light travel to designated rally points. Dr. Kim Hyejin led one of the monitoring teams and established observation posts in the outer regions of the abandonment zone. Her mission was to study the entity's expansion patterns and determine whether it showed signs of following the evacuating human populations. The data she collected would be crucial for determining where humanity could safely establish new colonies. The entity appears to be focused on converting existing reality structures rather than expanding into empty space, Hyejin reported during her final transmission. Its influence spreads through areas that contain complex matter and energy configurations, but shows little interest in uninhabited void regions. This suggests that our evacuation strategy may be effective if we can maintain sufficient distance from the transformation zone. The evacuation fleets carried detailed records of human civilization, scientific knowledge accumulated over centuries of space exploration. 200 years had passed since humanity vanished from the galaxy, leaving behind only empty worlds and the growing scar of the entity's influence across 3 major stellar sectors. The reformed Galactic Council had relocated to the far spiral arm and learned to live with the reality that entire regions of space now operated according to mathematical principles that defied comprehension. Younger species grew up accepting that there were places in the universe where ships could exist in multiple locations simultaneously and where cause followed effect in probability loops rather than linear sequences. Archival keeper Velthani maintained the records of lost civilizations in the Council's primary data repository on Sanctuary Station. Her species, the ethereal Nethari, possessed natural abilities to perceive temporal anomalies and had become the galaxy's unofficial historians of reality distortions. The human records occupied a significant section of the archives, documenting a species that had achieved remarkable technological advancement before triggering the greatest catastrophe in galactic history. The Nethari archives contained detailed accounts of humanity's final days in known space, including their systematic evacuation and the complete abandonment of colonies that had taken centuries to establish. Velthani had studied the human psychological profiles extensively and concluded that their species possessed an unusual combination of curiosity and adaptability that made them both dangerous and potentially valuable as galactic citizens. The humans never learned to accept limitations imposed by fear or tradition, Velthani noted in her historical analysis. Their refusal to acknowledge the impossible drove them to achievements that more cautious species would never attempt. But it also led them to awaken something that should have remained dormant until the heat death of the universe. Dr. Takmor of the Reformed Council's Science Division detected the first anomalous signals on a routine monitoring sweep of the entity zones. His instruments registered transmissions that shouldn't exist, emanating from the deepest regions of space, where reality had been transformed beyond recognition. The signals carried mathematical structures that predated the current universe, but were formatted according to communication protocols that suggested intelligent origin. The transmissions appeared simultaneously across multiple dimensional layers, making them impossible to trace to a specific source location. Analysis revealed that they were being broadcast from points that existed in 11-dimensional space, but were somehow connected to 3-dimensional reality through quantum probability bridges. The content was encoded in mathematical languages that the Council's translation systems couldn't process without risking cognitive damage to the operators. The signals are definitely artificial in origin, Takmor reported to the Council's emergency session. They're using communication technologies that operate on principles we don't understand. But the underlying mathematical frameworks suggest they originated from a technologically advanced civilization that has learned to exist within the entity's transformed reality zones. Senior analyst Keth Nara of the Valdari delegation recognized patterns in the signal structures that matched linguistic elements from ancient human communication protocols. The mathematical harmonics contained traces of human language evolution, suggesting that the transmissions were coming from the descendants of the species that had vanished 2 centuries earlier. However, the signals also contained elements that had never existed in any known form of human communication. The first decoded message arrived as a priority transmission that bypassed the Council's normal communication filters and appeared directly in the consciousness of every representative simultaneously. The words formed in each species' native language while maintaining mathematical precision that suggested translation through dimensional probability matrices rather than conventional linguistic conversion systems. Preparation complete. The message began with harmonics that resonated across multiple reality layers. Beginning containment protocol. The mathematical frameworks have been stabilized, and the entity has agreed to voluntary restriction of its expansion parameters. Reality restoration will commence in sequential phases to minimize disruption to established galactic civilization patterns. The council chambers erupted in confusion as representatives struggled to comprehend the implications of receiving communications from within the entity zones. According to all established scientific models, conscious life couldn't exist in regions where the fundamental laws of physics had been replaced by flexible mathematical suggestions. Yet the transmissions clearly indicated not only survival, but technological advancement beyond anything previously recorded. Fleet Commander Yex Tall of the Council Defense Forces authorized long-range reconnaissance missions to investigate the source of the mysterious transmissions. The scout ships were equipped with experimental shielding technologies designed to protect crews from reality distortions, but even these advanced protective systems had never been tested against the extreme conditions found within the entity zones. The reconnaissance vessels discovered something impossible as they approached the boundaries of the transformed regions. Ships were emerging from the deepest parts of the entity zones, vessels that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously while maintaining coherent 3-dimensional forms. The design aesthetics were recognizably human, but the technology incorporated engineering principles that allowed the ships to exist in 11-dimensional space without losing structural integrity. Captain Zorthek commanded the lead reconnaissance vessel and established first contact with the emerging fleet. The response came through communication channels that didn't exist on his ship, arriving as direct neural transmissions that somehow avoided the psychological damage typically associated with exposure to multidimensional information streams. We are the human species, evolved beyond our original 3-dimensional limitations. The transmission carried overtones that suggested vast experience with cosmic-scale engineering projects. We have spent 2 centuries learning to exist within the mathematical frameworks that the entity requires for its survival. We have become something that can coexist with both your reality and the entity's transformed reality zones. Admiral Chen Boyong spoke for the returning human fleet in a voice that resonated across probability spectrums while remaining comprehensible to three-dimensional consciousness. Her image appeared on the Council's communication screens as something recognizably human but enhanced with sensory organs that could perceive 11-dimensional space directly. Her crew moved with fluid precision that suggested they could see around corners and through solid matter. "We did not abandon the galaxy to save ourselves," Chen announced to the assembled council representatives. "We departed to find a way to solve the problem we had created." The entity was never evil or malevolent. It was simply following its nature as a form of life that existed on scales beyond individual planets or star systems. Our task was to learn how to communicate with it and establish boundaries that would allow both forms of existence to coexist. Captain Ryu Da-hyun transmitted detailed technical specifications describing the solution humanity had developed during their 2 centuries in exile. The data showed that they had learned to exist as living paradoxes, maintaining both 3-dimensional and 11-dimensional forms simultaneously. This dual existence allowed them to serve as translators between the entity and normal reality. "The entity feeds on mathematical complexity," Da-hyun explained while her hands manipulated control interfaces that extended into folded space. "It requires reality structures that can support 11-dimensional mathematics. But it doesn't need to consume the entire universe to satisfy that requirement. We have learned to create pocket dimensions that provide the entity with sufficient mathematical complexity while leaving normal spacetime undisturbed." Dr. Yoon Taekwon, now humanity's lead specialist in dimensional engineering, described the containment process that would restore normal physics to the affected regions. The technique involved creating stable interfaces between 3-dimensional and 11-dimensional space that satisfied the entity's needs while gradually reducing its influence over normal stellar mechanics. "The entity has agreed to voluntary containment because we can provide it with artificially created mathematical frameworks that are more sophisticated than natural reality," Taekwon reported while equations flowed across his consciousness in patterns visible to observers equipped with dimensional perception enhancement. "We have become gardeners of impossibility, cultivating paradoxes that the entity finds more interesting than consuming existing star systems." The first phase of reality restoration began with the systematic withdrawal of the entity's influence from the outermost affected regions. Human teams worked in coordination with the entity's consciousness to redirect its attention toward the artificial dimensional spaces that had been constructed specifically for its habitation. The process required precise timing and mathematical coordination that only the transformed humans could provide. Stellar engineer Kim Seo-hyun led the teams responsible for re-establishing normal physics in the recovered regions. Her work involved carefully adjusting the fundamental constants that governed matter and energy,